Hello, this is one of about 200 talks that I'm recording on the history of Western art. I've divided the talks into sections. This is section 10 on the Renaissance, and this part is an introduction to the early Italian Renaissance, and I'll be introducing artists like Cimabue and Giotto. Starting with Cimabue, he was born in Ceni di Peppo around 1240, which is near Florence, and he was the pioneering artist of the early Italian Renaissance. He's considered the last great Italian painter in the Byzantine style, but simultaneously he laid the groundwork for what I'll be showing you later, the naturalistic approach that would define Renaissance art. He was also an artist who trained Giotto. Giotto was Cimabue's apprentice, and the contributions they made can be seen here in this early work by Cimabue, the crucifix. Three-dimensional figures with volume and weight, the use of chiaroscuro, that is light and shadow, in order to create this naturalistic feel and depth, and emotional expressiveness in the characters who are situated in a naturalistic space, and typically dynamism, a dynamic, moving composition. This is the crucifix in the Basilica of San Domenico in Arezzo, and it was created between about 1267 and 1271. It was a pivotal moment in the transition from medieval, that is Byzantine art, to Renaissance art. It's a large wooden crucifix. It was commissioned by the Dominican order for their church in Arezzo. And it's interesting that mendicant orders like the Dominicans were advocating for a more humanized religiosity, and that influenced Cimabue's representation of Christ's suffering. There's a shift in his depiction of what's known as Christus Patiens, the suffering Christ. It's a departure from early Byzantine traditions, and it was inspired by, or I think reflected, the more human religiosity of the Dominicans. Cimabue was drew inspiration from the Giunta Pisano crucifix in Bologna, and he's elevated the art form by introducing these greater realism and expressionism, the contortion of the body of Christ, the use of chiaroscuro. An interesting historical note: the church it's housed in hosted the first conclave in the history of the Roman Church in 1276. Now, this work and others had a big influence on later artists. It paved the way for this more naturalistic approach. And Giotto, as we'll see in a moment, would develop further innovations. Another work by Cimabue is the Meister, created around 1280, now here housed in the Louvre. It's a very important work. It's a large work. It's about 4 meters high, and it depicts the Madonna and Child surrounded by angels, apostles and saints. Now, at this time he created this, Cimabue was probably working in Florence, where he was born, or near Florence, and where he spent most of his career. We don't know the exact circumstances of the commission in this case, but it was originally created for a church in Pisa, possibly San Francesco, and it reflects his growing reputation as a master painter in late 13th century Italy. This Meister showcases his innovative approach because, as you can see, he's humanizing the figures, creating the illusion of 3 dimensions and reality, although of course at this stage the perspective rendering isn't mathematically accurate, but you can see the attempts at perspective. The throne is set at an angle, demonstrating an early attempt at perspective, and this refinement of perspective would be further developed by Giotto. We've learnt a lot from the Louvre's recent restoration work done on this work. We've found that the original colours were far more vibrant and included the use of precious ultramarine or lapis lazuli for the blues. Also, in the clothing and the design, there are Arabic influences reflecting cultural exchanges of the time. This another work by Cimabue. This is the Santa Trinita Meister, created between 1290 and 1300 for the Church of Santa Trinita in Florence. Again, we don't know the exact details of the commission, but we believe it was requested by the Vallambrosian order because they governed Santa Trinita at the time. And again, it's another example of how his reputation was growing. According to the art historian Giorgio Vasari, the work remained in Santa Trinita until 1471, when it was moved to a side chapel. And over the years, it was relegated again to the monastery's infirmary, but it was rediscovered and transferred to the Accademia in 1810, and finally to the Uffizi Gallery in 1919. It's undergone several restorations, including one in 1890 that returned it to its original pointed form. It had been cut into a rectangular shape, we don't know when. And it highlights the attitude in the 19th century to what they called primitive Italian art. The word isn't a derogatory word. It was used to mean gentle and pure. Cimabue died in Pisa around 1302, and he left behind a body of work that we can now see bridge the gap between the medieval and the Renaissance. Perhaps the most lasting legacy he left was the training of his apprentice Giotto, and according to Vasari, he found Giotto when he was just 10 years old, drawing sheep on a rock, and so impressed was he by his talent, he took him on immediately as an apprentice. We don't know whether the story is true, of course, but it's a great story. So we now come to perhaps the greatest master and innovator of the early Italian Renaissance, Giotto di Bendone, the father of European painting. This is his Madonna and Child from 1295 to 1300. He was probably in his late 20s or early 30s, working in Florence when he painted this. And he was establishing his reputation then as a groundbreaking artist. You can see again, like his master Cimabue, how he's departed from the religious and strict, formal, rigid Byzantine style and introduced a much more human approach to religious subjects. And this is an example from what's called early, sometimes called proto-Renaissance period. The Madonna is supporting the Christ child on her left knee. There are two angels flanking them. The ample form of the Virgin has a gentle gaze, expressing a very human sense of motherhood. The Christ child is clothed in a robe, carries a scroll and blesses us with his right hand. The scroll represents knowledge. The panel, incidentally, was originally larger because the top end was pointed, cuspidate, and it was commissioned for the church of San Giorgio alla Costa in Florence, which was one of the main priories of the medieval Florence. It wasn't actually attributed, that is, recognised as a work by Giotto until 1939, when a German art critic found it in storage and realised from the style and techniques used that it was a work by Giotto. A much more well-known work by Giotto is this work in Assisi. In fact, I recommend you visit Assisi if you can. This is in the upper church of San Francesco, and there's a remarkable cycle of 28 scenes depicting the life of St. Francis, of which Giotto is believed to have painted 25, and I've selected one of them, this one, St. Francis preaching to the birds. They were painted between 1296 and 1304, this particular work between 1297 and 99. Now, Giotto was in his early 30s. He was working in Assisi, and it was commissioned as part of the decoration of the newly built Basilica of St. Francis, reflecting the growing cult of St. Francis and the Franciscan order and their increasing influence. What we see is St. Francis bending forward, preaching to a flock of birds, with a companion looking in awe. It illustrates a famous episode in St. Francis's life and emphasises his connection with nature and his ability to communicate God's message to all creatures. It's an even bigger, as you can see, a bigger departure from the prevailing still Byzantine style. Naturalism, 3 dimensions, set in a landscape, emotional depth, a very innovative approach at the time, evidenced as well by his realistic portrayal of the birds and the expressive gestures of the figures. There are other works in the upper church and the lower church, including 4 doctors of the church. Some of them, their attribution is debated as to whether they were painted by Giotto. Luckily, the church has survived, and the frescoes have survived, sent through centuries, including a devastating earthquake in 1997 that actually damaged part of the basilica, and that damage gave rise to recent restoration efforts that have given us even more insights into his techniques and the original appearance of the frescoes. But let me switch to another of his works, the Scriveni Chapel, sometimes called the Arena Chapel, in Padua. Again, I recommend you visit. Entering the Scriveni Chapel is a wonderful experience. You have to book ahead, and then when you arrive at the set time, you wait for about 20 minutes in a special room outside, like an airlock, while the temperature and humidity of the room in which you're situated are equalised with the chapel. You then get let into the chapel, but you only get about 15 minutes inside before you're hurried out. Now, Giotto completed the frescoes between 1303 and 1305, and I think the Scriveni chapel is a pivotal moment in Western art history. The reason it's called that is it was commissioned by Enrico Scriveni, who was a wealthy banker, and he was seeking to atone for the sin of usury. Giotto was in his late 30s by then, at the height of his artistic powers and reputation. The frescoes cover the entire interior of the chapel, as you can see, and they depict scenes from the lives of the Virgin Mary and Christ. And on the end wall, there's a monumental Last Judgment, which I talk about in another one of my talks. Giotto's innovation is seen here most clearly, the way he revolutionized painting with naturalism and emotional depth, and I'll show you one work illustrating that in a moment. He worked with a team of about 40 collaborators, and they completed the frescoes in about 625 work days, or giornate. The reason is frescoes are painted into wet plaster, and the plaster dries within a day, and so when you are working on a fresco in the morning, you apply a layer of wet plaster onto the top of a plaster base, and then you have to paint that complete day's work into that section of wet plaster, and the paint soaks into the plaster, and then as it dries, it consolidates the paint within the plaster, and it lasts for centuries. And so it requires, certainly for something this large, meticulous planning and execution. There was one incident in 1305. The friars from a nearby church complained that Scriveni was creating unfair competition because he was transforming his private oratory into a church because he'd built a bell tower, and this led to the demolition of the chapel's original apse and transept to turn it back into a private chapel. Again, the Scriveni chapel has endured for centuries and survived even the devastating earthquake I mentioned just now of 1997, and it was declared part of UNESCO World Heritage in 2021. This is the work that I said, there are many works around the walls, as you could see, but I've selected this one, the Resurrection. What we see on the left are sleeping Roman soldiers. Above them is an empty tomb with an angel sitting on it. On the right, Mary Magdalene, who recognizes Jesus as he flees, moves away from her, calling out "Noli me tangere," which is an expression that means "don't touch me," or I think more accurately, "stop clinging to me," meaning that the physical pre-resurrection relationship must be replaced by a new spiritual relationship. Her expression is one of a combination of disbelief and hope, and her arms outstretched show her desperation to reach Jesus, but he retreats, and his left arm is actually painted outside of the frame. The flag he holds, difficult to read here, but it shows his triumph over death. It says Vic, top left, Tor, top right, Mortis, victor over death, and the red signifies suffering, and the white purity. As you can see, the work that I've selected shows you very clearly how far we've now moved away from Byzantine art. Final work by Giotto that I wanted to show you is Ognissanti Meister, or sometimes called the Ognissanti Madonna, between 1310 and 1315. It's a monumental tempera painting on wood. It's over 3 meters high, and it's now in the Uffizi. It was originally commissioned for a Florentine church called the Ognissanti, which means All Saints, and that's how it got its name. And incidentally, the word Meister means majesty, and it refers to this type of painting where we see the Virgin holding Christ on her knee on a throne. He, again, as we often see, is blessing with his right hand and holding a small scroll symbolizing knowledge in his left hand. The angels kneeling at the foot of the throne offer a vase of lilies and roses, referencing charity and purity, while the ones to the side of the throne are holding a crown and a pyx, a religious item that refers to the Passion of Christ. He was at his height of his artistic powers when he painted this, and he'd recently completed the groundbreaking frescoes of the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. And he was again living and working primarily in Florence, where he owned a house, enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle with his family, including his wife and their children. Again, this represents a significant evolution of the Meister transition and tradition, transitioning from the wider format of the Sienese Meisters that we'll see later. He shows us a vertical composition, and the transition from Byzantine to early Renaissance. The one interesting anecdote worth mentioning, we don't know whether it's true, but Pope Benedict XI, before he would commission an artist, he would send a messenger to collect a sample of a drawing by the artist, and it's reportedly Giotto simply drew a perfect red circle freehand in front of the messenger, who took it back, and that perfect circle demonstrated his mastery and impressed the Pope. I'd now like to introduce another school of art in Italy. This school was based in Siena. Now, in the 13th century, Siena was a major commercial and banking centre and had a thriving economy based on wool. It was also on the main pilgrimage route to Rome, and so pilgrims brought their wealth from all over Europe. It was a self-governing commune. It had a strong military, and the city had built an impressive cathedral in the 12th century. Although later, in the late 13th and early 14th century, Siena declined as Florence surpassed it in economic and political influence. But the artists, the Sienese School that I'll be talking about, are first of all Duccio di Bonizena, considered the father of Sienese painting, and this is one of his masterpieces, a Meister, a monumental work commissioned for the city of Siena for the high altar of its cathedral. It's a religious work, but it also reflects civic pride, and it was created to honour one of the patron saints of Siena, the Virgin Mary. And it was painted at a time when there was a particular heightened Marianne devotion. Later I'll be showing you three other Sienese artists, Simone Martini, Pietro Lorenzetti, and his brother Ambrosio Lorenzetti. And together they developed this distinctive Sienese style with its very rich colours, its gold leaf backgrounds, and its blending together of Byzantine and early Renaissance naturalism. This work, the Meister by Duccio, has a central panel of the Virgin and Child enthroned, surrounded by saints and angels. Below there's a predella showing scenes from Christ's early life. On the reverse there's a number of 43, in fact, panels narrating the Passion of Christ. And the inscription on the base reads, Holy Mother of God, be thou the cause of peace for Siena, and life to Duccio, because he painted thee thus. If I show you for a moment a close-up of the central panel, I can explain how it reflects the civic life of Siena, because in the front row of the saints we have Siena's patron saints, Saint Ansanus, Saint Sabinus, Saint Crescentius and Saint Victor, running from left to right across the front. And it's in the next row back that we get the more familiar saints, starting from the left, Catherine of Alexandria with her palm frond, Saint Paul the Apostle, whose attribute includes a sword, Saint John the Apostle or Evangelist, whose attribute includes a book, and on the right, John the Baptist, always recognisable because of his camel hair outer garment, then Saint Peter and Saint Agnes, whose attribute includes a lamb. It was completed in 1311 and was marked by a grand procession through Siena, with its citizens celebrating its installation in the cathedral. So it was significant as both a religious icon and a symbol of communal identity. Another work by Duccio, the Madonna Rucellai, created between 1285 and 1286. It's large, it's over 4.5 metres tall. In fact, it's the largest known 13th century panel painting. It was commissioned by the Compagnia di Laudesi, who were a Florentine confraternity devoted to singing praises to the Virgin Mary, and they commissioned it for their recently completed Dominican church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. Interestingly, it's we have the oldest known Italian document of its kind. We have the contract for this work dated April the 15th, 1285, and it tells us exactly how much detail a commission would go into in instructing the painter. Duccio was told to paint the Virgin and Child with other figures for 150 lira, using ultramarine or lapis lazuli for the Virgin's robe and real gold leaf for the background. And the contract specified that Duccio must work exclusively on this piece without any workshop assistance. Interestingly, although we now know it's 100% Duccio, it was misattributed to Cimabue for centuries, an error that was perpetuated by Giorgio Vasari in his book Lives of the Most Eminent Painters, Sculptors and Architects, showing that he wasn't always right. It's always dangerous to take a single source. And the mistake wasn't corrected until 1889. And originally it was realised to be by Duccio for stylistic reasons. Over the centuries, it's been moved several times. In 1591, it was transferred to the Rucellai family chapel, which is how it got its current name. And it was eventually moved to the Uffizi Gallery, where, in fact, it greets visitors at the beginning of the Uffizi Gallery tour in Florence. Simone Martini. This is Meister by Martini, completed in 1315. It's a monumental fresco. It's nearly 10 meters wide, and it's on the north wall of the Sala del Mappamondi in Siena's Palazzo Pubblico, and it was commissioned by the Governo di Nove, who are Siena's ruling council, and it's a symbol of good governance and civic pride, and it's among his Martini's first documented works. We think Martini was a pupil of Duccio, although according to Giorgio Vasari he was a pupil of Giotto, but as we've seen, Vasari wasn't always right. The commission is noteworthy because the government of Siena chose Martini over the more established Duccio, probably or possibly because of Martini's superior skill at frescoes, at wall painting. And this work launched Martini's career. He worked on the fresco in stages. He began in around 1312, but his work was interrupted because he had to go to Assisi. When he returned, he completed the lower portion in 1315, and I think you can probably see that the lower figures, there's a change in technique and materials. We see the Virgin and Child enthroned. It's a horizontal work, surrounded as they are by angels and saints in a scene reminiscent of a courtly gathering. It's notable, I think, for its harmony and refinement and ornamental qualities, particularly in the garments and the throne. We don't know exactly why, but he was called back to rework the Meister in 1321, only 6 years after he completed it. I think it probably indicates the importance of this civic treasure, and they probably wanted him to paint some further improvements to the work. Or I use the word paint into the plaster. It's a fresco. This is a work by Martini in the San Martino Chapel. The Cappella di San Martino is a chapel in the lower Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, which is in Umbria. The work was commissioned and funded by Cardinal Gentile Portino da Montefiore, and it's a cycle of frescoes portraying the life of Saint Martin of Tours in 4th century France. And I've selected this one work, The Miracle of the Resurrected Child, scene 5. It's based on a miracle that's alleged to have taken place while Saint Martin was praying. A woman approached him holding a dead child, and he brought it back to life. Now, the scene was meant to have taken place near Chartres, but Martini has taken artistic license by combining it with a legend that Saint Martini performed a resurrection miracle near Siena. And so the building on the right has been identified as the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, and so he's combined the miracle near Chartres with the miracle said to have taken place near Siena. There's a number of onlookers, a mixture of different people praying, but I thought I'd draw attention to the knight with the blue hat because I find it interesting, unusual. He's expressing what looks to me like astonishment, if not disbelief, at the miracle taking place. Although, if you look at his companion to his left, his companion seems to disapprove of his skepticism. I wonder why he was painted in that way. It just leads me to think how much religious skepticism and skepticism at miracles in particular was taking place in the 14th century Italy. This is a well-known work by Martini, now in the Uffizi Gallery. Made originally for the altar of Saint Anselmus in Siena Cathedral, we see the Archangel Gabriel appearing before the Virgin Mary and speaking the words, "Hail, full of grace, the Lord is with you." Mary, who's been reading, instinctively draws back at this sudden appearance, pulls her cloak around her body. There's a marble floor. She's sitting on a throne. She's been reading a book. And all of these attributes are part of the lifestyle of the wealthy in 14th century Siena. Above them is the Holy Spirit, represented as a dove. On the left is the martyr, Saint Anselmus, one of the patron saints of Siena, bearing a banner with the city's colours. And the inscription indicates it was created by two Sienese painters, Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi, but art critics attribute most of the conception and execution to Simone. Now, Simone Martini shared a workshop with Memmi, and Memmi later married his sister, so they obviously had a close family relationship. So maybe that's why he added his name to the attribution. This is Pietro Lorenzetti, Birth of the Virgin, 1335 to 42. It's tempera on panel, and it's in Siena Cathedral. And what we see on the left is Mary's father, Joachim. He seems to be anxiously waiting for the news of the birth. Together with a child and an old man, it's possible that the child is bringing him, just at the point of bringing him news of the birth, as he leans forward listening. Behind him there's an open lunette, an arcade showing the court of a Gothic palace. In the central panel there's Saint Anne reclining on a bed while attendants bathe the newborn Mary. There's a woman wearing a red dress shown behind the right pillar. Interestingly, she occupies space in both the central and the right-hand panel, something that I believe hasn't been done before. She holds an inlaid object. I'm not sure what it is. It could be a banner, it could be a form of musical instrument. In the right panel we see attendants who are bringing further clothing and towels for the newborn Mary. This triptych was created for the altar of Saint Sabinus in Siena Cathedral. It's now in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Siena, not in the cathedral. It was commissioned as part of a cycle of 4 altarpieces illustrating the life of the Virgin Mary. And you can see his attention to architectural details and spatial rendering, including the woman's red dress, as I mentioned, appearing 2 sides of the column, just giving further authenticity to the painted architectural detail with its vaulted ceiling and Gothic windows and tiled floor. The inscription, there is an inscription, it's a bit hard to see, but there's an inscription underneath which reads, translated, Pietro Lorenzetti of Siena painted me in 1342, which is useful because it provides definitive attribution and dating. This is a room in the Palazzo Pubblico, the government building in Siena. It's by the brother of Pietro. This is by Ambrogio Lorenzetti. We know that they shared tools, but they didn't share a workshop, and they seem to have worked mostly independently and have slightly different styles. This fresco by Ambrogio was commissioned by the city's Council of 9, and unusually it's not a religious subject, it's a civic subject. And Italy, remember, at the time consisteed of city-states, but it was a turbulent time of violent struggles, the 14th century. So each city-state had to have a strong military, and they had a very strong belief in the in themselves. And there are 6 murals in this room, including the allegory of good government, which we see here in front of us, an allegory of bad government, and then the effects of bad government in the city, the effects of bad government in the country, and the effects of good government in the city and the country. The allegory of good government we see here includes allegorical figures of justice, peace, fortitude, and prudence. Justice is the one looking up to wisdom, emphasizing the importance of wise government. And the citizens, it's a bit hard to see in this reproduction, but they're bound by a cord that starts from the scales of justice, symbolizing civic harmony. And if we look at the effects of good government, which is in much better condition, it shows a city thriving with bustling markets. Notice in the centre figures dancing to the sound of a tambourine, peaceful streets, a lot of activity, people buying and selling. There is also the effects of good government in the countryside, which shows prosperous farms and safe travel. In contrast, the allegory of bad government, which is not in very good condition, but if you look to the right, you'll see a demonic figure representing tyranny and flanked by vices like cruelty, deceit and fury. Justice is bound before the tyrant. You can see the figure in white that's bound lying in front of the tyrant, illustrating the suppression of fairness under poor rule. And there's another wall showing the effects of bad government. It shows a city in decay with crime and destruction, both within the city and out in the rural setting. This work was groundbreaking for its time. It's the first secular painting of Siena's early Renaissance, and it is one of the earliest detailed landscapes depicting Italian city life and country life. Moving back to religious devotional item here for personal devotion, it's a portable triptych, and it shows, with the doors closed, the three kings visiting the newborn Christ. It's by Bernardo Daddi, and it's in the courtyard. If I open the doors and we look inside, we see the Virgin Mary on a throne with her young Christ. We see representations of Christ's birth and death on the left and right. Daddi began his career as an apprentice to Giotto, and this is one of his finest works, one of Daddi's finest works. It includes a lot of lively detail. It uses expensive pigments and it uses pure gold. And Daddi was particularly known for his ability to create these touching small details. And he was also known for his ability to produce these small scale works like this triptych. Above, right at the top, you can see an image of God the Father performing benediction, reinforcing the heavenly nature of the gathering below, creating a sort of visual hierarchy, God at the top overseeing the holy assembly below. And there are various saints shown that would have been particularly significant to the original patron. The courtyard, the work was bequeathed to the courtyard in 1978. This is not Daddi but Gaddi, Taddeo Gaddi, the Baroncelli Chapel in Santa Croce. It's at the end of the right transept in Santa Croce, and the frescoes were completed between 1328 and 1338. It's the story of the Virgin that's being represented. By the way, if you look on the left, the altarpiece is called the Baroncelli Polyptych, and it's by Giotto, but the remainder of the chapel is by Gaddi. Gaddi was one of Giotto's most talented pupils, and his particular master of colour and light and the creation of strong narrative themes. It's known as the Baroncelli Chapel because it was commissioned by the Baroncelli family as a private chapel. And it shows a transition from Giotto's naturalism towards a slightly more ornamental style, still maintaining an emotional depth. For example, there are 3 narrative registers shown here with painted imitation of marble and with still life elements, showing his interest in classical illusionism. The registers show scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary, and at the top it begins with the expulsion of Joachim from the temple. One of the most notable scenes in the cycle is this one, the Annunciation of the Shepherds, considered to be the first night scene in Italian fresco painting. His innovative use of light and colour has enabled him to create this nocturnal landscape, which is still visually striking, even though he's painted it to represent night, and it's lit by the light of the angel. It's one of the best preserved fresco cycles in Santa Croce. Still, the colours are still quite vibrant. Which brings me to the end of my brief tour of early Renaissance art in Italy. Led by Cimabue and Giotto and the Sienese School, but the Florentine School eventually overtook the Sienese School, and the innovations of Cimabue Giotto, together combined with the Sienese artists, were a foundation for later artists that I cover in other talks: Masaccio, Fra Angelico, Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and so on. But that brings me to the end of today's talk. Thank you for your time and attention, and I would just need to say goodbye for now, or as I often say, cheerio.